My name is Josephine Calloway. I'm 38 years old. I was standing in a hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning, phone shaking in my hand, listening to a family court clerk tell me that my sister-in-law had filed an emergency custody petition against me, and that a judge had already granted a temporary order. My 2 children, Mabel and Otis, were no longer allowed to come home with me. Not that night, not until a hearing. I remember the exact sound the phone made when I dropped it on the asphalt because I didn't feel my hand open. I just heard it hit the ground. What none of them knew, including the judge who signed that order in about 4 minutes based on nothing but a stack of paper, was that I had spent the entire evening at that hospital because my son had a severe allergic reaction. And I had photographs, timestamps, and 2 nurses who could confirm exactly where I'd been every single minute of the night my aunt swore, in writing, that I'd abandoned my children in a locked car. I want you to picture where you are right now while I tell you the rest of this. Are you lying down or sitting up? Is there a light on near you, or are you in the dark? Tell me in the comments, because where I was, it was raining, and I remember thinking, standing over my own shattered phone in that parking lot. She planned this. She didn't stumble into this. She planned every piece of it. I grew up the only daughter of 2 parents who worked constantly, which meant my aunt, Dolores, my father's older sister, filled in a lot of the gaps: school pickups, sick days, the occasional summer week when my parents traveled for work. On paper, Dolores looked like the family's steady hand, the one everyone called first in a crisis. Underneath that, she was something else entirely. A woman who needed to be needed so badly that she quietly resented anyone whose life didn't require rescuing. And I think, looking back now, some small ember of that resentment had been sitting inside her toward me since I was a teenager, because I never needed rescuing the way she wanted me to. The family dynamic was simple on the surface. Dolores was Aunt Dee, beloved, endlessly available, the woman who remembered every birthday and showed up with soup when anyone got sick. Underneath, she kept a ledger nobody else could see, a running tally of who owed her, who disappointed her, who'd forgotten to thank her properly. She never raised her voice. She specialized in a particular kind of sigh, long and theatrical, that told you exactly how much she was suffering on your behalf without her ever having to say a single accusing word. Here's the thing nobody in my family understood about my custody situation, and it matters later, so hold on to it. After my divorce 3 years ago, I had full legal and physical custody of Mabel and Otis, clean and uncontested, with my ex-husband's blessing because he'd relocated for work and we both agreed it made sense. There was no ongoing custody dispute. There was no history of any complaint against me anywhere, ever. Which meant that for Dolores to get an emergency order granted overnight, she needed to convince a judge on paper that my children were in immediate danger. And she did it in under a week. Something had already started to feel wrong about 2 months before that night, and I want to tell you about it now because it matters more than it seemed to at the time. Dolores had started asking to take the kids for extra weekends, more than usual, and twice she'd mentioned, almost offhand, that Mabel had said something concerning to her, nothing specific, just a vague, worried tone dropped into conversation and then waved away with, "Oh, don't worry about it, I'm sure it's nothing." I know now that she was building a file. At the time, I thought she was just being Dolores. My flaw, if I'm honest with you, is that I trusted family instinctively, almost automatically, the way you trust that the floor will hold you when you step on it. I had spent my whole life watching Dolores show up for everyone, and it never once occurred to me that showing up and caring about someone's well-being were not, in her case, the same thing. It took losing access to my own children for 11 days to understand that the difference matters more than almost anything else in the world. The night itself started with a phone call from the school nurse at 4 in the afternoon. Otis, my 7-year-old, had eaten something with tree nuts at an after-school program despite his allergy being on every form the school had. And by the time I got him to the emergency room, his face had already started to swell. I called Dolores from the ER waiting room because she was listed as a backup contact, mostly to let her know Mabel would need picking up from her dance class since I couldn't leave the hospital. She said she'd handle it. She sounded calm, warm, exactly like herself. I had no reason in that moment to think anything except that I was lucky to have her. What I didn't know was that Dolores picked Mabel up an hour early, before dance class had even ended, and drove her not home, but to a lawyer's office 2 towns over, where Mabel, 9 years old, tired, confused, and coached with just enough leading questions, signed a handwritten statement, at Dolores' urging, describing nights that never happened. Being left alone, being scared, being hungry. Mabel didn't understand what she was signing. She told me later she thought she was helping Aunt Dee with paperwork for a school project. By the time I left the hospital with Otis stable and sleeping, close to midnight, Dolores had already filed. She'd used the hours I was terrified in an ER waiting room, holding my son's hand while nurses monitored his breathing, to build a case that I was an unfit, neglectful mother. The emergency order cited credible, immediate concern for child safety, and was signed by a judge who never once tried to call me first. There was a moment, maybe 3 days into all of this, when my mother, Dolores' own sister-in-law, called me, not to comfort me, but to gently suggest that maybe I should just let Dee help for a little while. That she'd always been good with the kids, that maybe this was, in her words, a blessing in disguise while I got back on my feet. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after that call, understanding for the first time just how easily people will choose the version of a story that requires the least from them. If you want to understand where Dolores' need to control actually came from, you have to go back further than either of us lived. Her own mother, my grandmother, had left the family when Dolores was 6 years old, and Dolores had spent the rest of her childhood being the one who held things together, the one adults leaned on instead of the other way around. I only understood this fully years later from a conversation with my father, but once I heard it, something clicked. Dolores had built her entire identity around being indispensable, and somewhere along the way, indispensable quietly curdled into entitled to intervene, whether anyone asked her to or not. That understanding didn't make the 11 days without my children hurt less, but it did something else. It made the plan I hadn't even fully admitted to myself feel less like anger and more like clarity. I want to be honest with you. Some part of this whole situation is almost unbearable to say out loud, even now. My son was recovering from anaphylactic shock, and while I sat beside his hospital bed, my aunt was 2 towns over coaching my 9-year-old daughter to sign a statement that would be used to take them both away from me. The last thing I did before that first hearing was call an attorney a friend from work had used during her own divorce, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priya Ashworth, and I remember saying to her, almost apologetically, "I don't even know where to start." Priya said one sentence that I've held on to ever since. "You start by finding out exactly what she said, in exactly what order, and then you prove every single word of it wrong." The scene itself, if I back up and give it to you properly, really started to unravel about 10 days after the emergency order, at the first temporary hearing, a small, fluorescent-lit courtroom that smelled like old carpet and coffee. Dolores sat 2 rows behind her own attorney, in a soft cardigan, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue before anyone had even said a word. The picture of a woman heartbroken over having to do something so difficult, so necessary, purely out of love. Her attorney read from Mabel's statement first, and I felt the floor tilt under me, hearing my daughter's handwriting. I recognized it instantly, the careful loops she'd only recently learned, describing things that had never happened. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white. Priya put a hand briefly over mine, just once, a signal to stay still. That was the calm cruelty, reasonable sounding, tearful, delivered with just enough sorrow that objecting to it made me look defensive instead of innocent. Dolores never raised her voice once in the entire hearing. She didn't have to. She'd already engineered the room to believe her before I said a single word. The secondary cruelty came about 20 minutes later, quieter and somehow worse, when Dolores' attorney mentioned, almost as an aside, that Dolores was prepared to take temporary guardianship indefinitely out of love for the children. Given the mother's apparent instability, a sentence that let the judge hear the word instability attached to my name without a shred of evidence behind it, simply because grief and panic on my face in that courtroom could be read. If you wanted to read it that way, as exactly that. Then came the silence, right after the judge asked me if I had anything to say. I remember it lasting only a few seconds, but I have never in my life experienced a few seconds that long, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, someone's chair creaking, Dolores dabbing her eyes again, waiting to see whether I'd finally crack in front of a room the way she seemed to expect I would. I didn't crack. I said quietly that I would be requesting a continuance to gather evidence and that I looked forward to demonstrating in full exactly where I had been on the night in question. The judge granted 2 weeks. It felt like nothing. It also felt like the only oxygen I'd had in 11 days. I left that courtroom without looking at Dollars, my sister walking beside me with her hand on my back the entire way to the parking lot, and somewhere between the courthouse steps and the car, standing in the same kind of cold rain that had been falling the night this all started, I made the first real decision of the whole ordeal. I was going to prove, beyond any possible doubt, exactly what Dollars had done and exactly why. I didn't sleep, not really, for most of those 2 weeks. I sat at my kitchen table with hospital printouts spread in front of me, the ER admission timestamp, the allergist's discharge notes, a text exchange with the school nurse, and Priya and I built a timeline down to the minute. Every single hour I was supposedly neglecting my children, I had a nurse, a doctor, a time-stamped hospital badge scan, or a text message proving otherwise. The next piece came from somewhere I hadn't expected. Otis, 7 years old and still a little pale from the reaction, asked me one evening why Aunt Dee had told the judge he was hungry and scared that night. Because he remembered eating crackers in the ER waiting room and watching cartoons on my phone the whole time. I asked him gently if he'd be willing to tell that to Priya in his own words on a recording, and he said very seriously, yes, because that's not what happened and Aunt Dee shouldn't lie. 4 days later, Priya obtained the intake sign-in log from the lawyer's office where Mabel's statement had been signed, through a subpoena tied to the emergency filing itself. The log showed an arrival time 40 minutes before Mabel's dance class had even ended, which meant Dollars had picked her up early without my permission or knowledge, specifically to get her to that office before I could possibly be reached. My first real lead, if I can call it that, turned out to be a dead end, and I want to tell you about it honestly because it wasted 2 days I didn't have to spare. I became convinced Dollars must have had help from her own attorney planning the timing, some coordinated strategy session, and I spent 2 days trying to trace phone records between them before that specific hearing, certain I'd find something damning there. It turned out the attorney had simply been retained the same week, standard timing, nothing coordinated about it at all. I felt foolish. I also felt oddly more determined because now I understood the truth wasn't going to be handed to me easily. I'd have to build it piece by piece myself. Priya requested a forensic interview from Mabel through the court's own child welfare evaluator, standard procedure in any custody dispute involving a child's statement. And I want to be honest that agreeing to it terrified me, the idea of my daughter being questioned by a stranger about any of this. But Priya was right that it was the only way to get an unbiased, professional account of exactly what Mabel remembered, on the record, protected from anyone coaching her again. The pressure started almost immediately after Priya filed for that forensic interview. The first message came from my mother 2 days later, her tone pitched somewhere between wounded and pleading. Josephine, please don't drag Mabel through more of this. Hasn't she been through enough? Can't you just let the lawyers handle it quietly? The second came from my father, gentler but just as pointed. Your aunt raised you half your childhood. Whatever's happened here, think about what you're about to do to this family. The third arrived by text from Dollars herself 3 days after that, short and cold. I did what I had to do to protect those children. You'll understand that someday when you're not so busy trying to destroy me. The second betrayal came from a place I genuinely hadn't braced for. My cousin Renata, Dollars' own daughter, who I'd always been close to, called me, not to comfort me, but to relay, almost apologetically, that the extended family had already talked it through and decided the kindest thing for everyone was for me to withdraw my objection and let Dollars keep temporary guardianship until things calmed down. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after she hung up, understanding for the first time just how many people had quietly agreed, behind my back, on a story about me before the forensic interview had even happened. The forensic interview took place 8 days later in a small, gentle room with soft chairs and a trained evaluator named Constance Whitfield, and Mabel carefully, in her own words, at her own pace, described being picked up early from dance, being told by Aunt Dee that sometimes grown-ups have to say things to help each other, even if it's a little bit not exactly true, and signing a paper she didn't fully understand because Aunt Dee told her it would help keep the family together. Constance's written evaluation, filed with the court a week later, used a phrase that Priya read aloud to me with something close to grim satisfaction. Significant concern regarding undue influence in coaching of the minor child by the petitioner. There's something almost darkly ironic about a woman who built her whole identity on being trusted, undone by the one person she trusted would never think to check her story, a 9-year-old. I sat in Priya's office reading Constance's evaluation and actually said out loud, "She really thought a child wouldn't remember the truth." And Priya, who hadn't cracked a smile in 3 meetings, allowed herself a small, tired one at that. The voice in my head that had spent 38 years giving family the benefit of the doubt finally said something different, sitting in that office. This isn't about winning in front of a judge. It's about making absolutely sure Dollars never gets the chance to do this to another family member's child. I want to say clearly, because some of you watching have lived something like this. If you have ever had someone weaponize your children against you and call it love, I understand exactly where that fear lies. 2 weeks before the family reunion, a gathering Dollars had almost unbelievably still planned to host, as if nothing had happened. The emergency custody order was formally dismissed, full physical and legal custody restored to me, and the court referred the matter to the county's Child Protective Services Division for review of Dollars' conduct, given Constance's evaluation. Priya looked at me across her desk and said flatly, "You got everything back, and you got it back documented permanently in a way she can never spin later." I believed her. But I still wanted one more thing, for the family who had quietly chosen her story over mine to hear, in one room at once, exactly what she had done. Getting everyone in that one room meant going to the reunion itself. 3 weeks later, a gathering at my grandparents' old lake house that every branch of the family attended without fail, 40-some people spread across a backyard strung with lights, the same folding tables that had hosted every reunion of my entire childhood. I chose that gathering deliberately, the way you choose the one room where a lie was allowed to live comfortably for years, because it deserved to die in the same place. Renata was there, the way she always was, standing near the drinks table with a plate she barely touched, exactly as she had at every family event before this, steady, watchful. The one relative who I suspected, underneath her earlier phone call, actually felt sick about the whole thing, which is precisely why I'd quietly asked her beforehand simply to stay close and pay attention. I started calmly. I waited until most of the family had gathered near the tables for dinner, and I asked, in a clear voice that didn't shake nearly as much as I expected it to, whether everyone would give me 5 minutes before we ate. Dollars, 3 seats down, went very still, her fork halfway to her plate, exactly the way I remembered feeling at that hospital parking lot weeks earlier. I said the timeline out loud, plainly, the hospital timestamps, the sign-in log from the lawyer's office, the 40 minutes Mabel was picked up early from dance without my knowledge. I watched several faces around that table shift slowly from polite confusion to something closer to horror. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Dollars laughed, once thin and unconvincing, and said I was twisting things, that I'd always had a flair for drama. I said it again, this time holding up Constance's written evaluation, the phrase undue influence and coaching of the minor child turned toward the table. The laughing stopped. Dollars tried one last thing, her voice climbing, insisting she'd only been trying to protect the children, that any aunt who loved her niece and nephew as much as she did would have done exactly the same thing in her position, that I was making something ugly out of what was, in her telling, simply love expressed a little too forcefully. My father started to say something in her defense out of old habit, and I let him finish. And then I said quietly that Mabel had described on a recorded forensic interview, being told by Aunt D that grown-ups sometimes have to say things.